The farmer became a laughingstock when he bought a skinny, sick donkey at the auction. The village laughed, the neighbors shook their heads, and his family watched his stubbornness with worry. But no one could have imagined that this very old donkey would bring the farmer not shame, but respect and glory, silencing all the mockers. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling fields, painting them in strokes of gold that could not hide the hard truth of a farmer's life. The village stirred with its familiar rhythm, and yet there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Today was auction day, the day when men and women from scattered farms would gather in the market square. Their hopes tied not only to animals and tools, but to the future they imagined they might shape from them. The auction was both business and spectacle, where fortunes could be nudged by the purchase of a sturdy plow horse or dashed by a gamble on sickly livestock. Farmers came dressed in their work clothes, their boots scuffed from soil, and their hands already roughened from chores done before sunrise. Children darted between wagons, wide-eyed and excited by the commotion, while older folks gathered in knots to share gossip, leaning on canes and speaking in voices cracked with the weight of years. The farmer at the heart of this tale walked into that noisy world with the deliberate step of a man who had known hardship and carried it silently. His clothes bore patches from years of repair, his hat had lost its shape long ago, and yet there was an unmistakable steadiness in his gaze. He had not come to parade wealth or strength, but because he knew that the smallest choices could decide the fate of his family through the seasons ahead. Around him, the smell of hay and manure mixed with the sharp tang of sweat and leather, the air alive with the neighing of horses, the low bellow of cattle, the bleating of sheep. Auctioneers called out prices in booming voices, their rapid words like drumbeats urging the crowd to bid higher, faster, stronger. Coins changed hands, papers were signed, and proud buyers led their new animals away under the watchful eyes of neighbors who judged each purchase as if it were their own. The farmer watched with quiet interest. He saw a young colt prancing in the sunlight, its mane rippling like fire. The crowd pressed close, eager to outbid one another. A pair of sturdy oxen drew appreciative nods, and men spoke of how much land they might plow in a single day. The air vibrated with energy, hope, and hunger for prosperity. Yet amid this clamor, in the shadow of a leaning fence at the far edge of the lot, stood something almost invisible. An old donkey, tethered with a frayed rope to a wooden post. The donkey's body told the story of years endured without kindness. His ribs pressed against thin skin, his flanks sagged, and his grayish-brown coat had dulled to the color of dust. His ears drooped low, twitching only now and then at the noise around him. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, as though he had long since stopped expecting attention or mercy. He stood apart from the lively clamor, motionless, a forgotten shadow among creatures valued for their strength and promise. Few even glanced his way, and those who did turned quickly, muttering under their breath about how worthless he looked. The farmer noticed him. Perhaps it was because the donkey's quiet presence contrasted so sharply with the rest of the auction, or perhaps it was something deeper, an instinct cultivated through years of seeing beyond what the world readily offered. He paused, studying the animal, and in that silence something shifted. The donkey raised his head slightly, their eyes meeting across the distance. What the farmer saw there was not emptiness, but a spark, faint and nearly extinguished, yet undeniable. He recognized it, for he too knew what it meant to be overlooked, dismissed, judged by appearances instead of worth. The auctioneer, full of energy from the earlier sales, finally approached the pen where the donkey stood. His voice, which had risen like a trumpet for the prized horses and cattle, fell now to something less enthusiastic. "We have here," he announced, "an old donkey, name of Jasper if the tag is right. Can't say he's got many good years left, but perhaps someone needs a companion animal, gentle enough for children." The words were met with laughter from some corners and silence from others. Nobody lifted a hand. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the price, but still no one spoke. It was then that the farmer stepped forward. He felt the weight of every eye turning toward him, the disbelief, the anticipation of ridicule. Still, his voice carried clear as he placed a bid, modest but firm, offering the few coins he could spare. For a moment, the marketplace stilled, the silence broken by a ripple of laughter that spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass. People shook their heads, nudged each other, whispering words sharp enough to cut. "Fool," someone muttered, "wasting money." Another barked, "That beast won't last the winter." A woman nearby covered her mouth, stifling a laugh. The farmer heard it all, every sneer and scoff, but he did not withdraw. The auctioneer, more relieved than impressed, declared the donkey sold. Papers were scribbled, a rope exchanged, and just like that, the farmer had taken ownership of what the world deemed useless. He walked toward the pen, his boots pressing into the dust, feeling the burn of eyes upon his back. As he approached, the donkey shifted his weight, uncertain. But when the farmer reached out a hand, rough and calloused from work, the animal did not shy away. Instead, he lowered his head, allowing the rope to be tied loosely around his neck. The crowd's laughter rose again, but it no longer mattered. The bond had begun. The farmer led the donkey away through the jeers and whispers. He kept his head high, though inside his chest his heart was heavy. He knew the ridicule would follow him beyond the square, back to his farm, into the very fabric of his daily life. He knew his family would question him, his neighbors would mock him, and even his own thoughts would press him with doubt in the quiet hours of night. But as he glanced at the donkey walking beside him, each step slow but steady, he felt a conviction that silenced those doubts. Somewhere within this frail, unwanted creature lay a strength hidden from eyes too quick to judge. The road stretched long and dusty as they left the bustle of the auction behind. The laughter faded with distance, replaced by the sound of the donkey's hooves dragging softly against the earth. The farmer held the rope gently, speaking no words, but in his silence lay a promise. This was not the end of the story, but its beginning. What seemed foolishness in the eyes of many would one day prove itself in ways they could not yet imagine. As the village shrank behind them and the fields opened wide ahead, the farmer walked on with his unlikely companion. The humiliation of the marketplace still clung to him, yet beneath it burned a quiet determination. He had chosen not with the eyes of the crowd, but with something deeper, a belief that worth was not measured in strength or youth alone, but in the resilience of spirit. The donkey walked beside him, frail but alive, and together they began a journey neither the farmer nor the villagers could foresee. A journey that would test patience, faith, and the courage to see value where others saw only failure. And so, under the wide sky and the lingering echo of cruel laughter, the man and the donkey returned home, the bond between them fragile but real, a seed planted in rocky soil, waiting for the chance to grow. The walk home from the auction was long, and each mile seemed to stretch further than the one before. The farmer felt the echo of laughter still buzzing in his ears, as if the crowd followed him along the dusty road. He held the rope loosely in his hand, glancing back every few steps at the old donkey who plodded behind him with a weary rhythm, his hooves dragging against the hardened earth. There was no majesty in the animal's gait, no sign of vigor or promise, only the stubborn persistence of a creature that refused to collapse despite every reason to surrender. The farmer kept his silence, knowing that words would change nothing now. He had chosen, and the burden of that choice was his to bear, no matter how heavy the weight of ridicule might become. When he finally reached the modest gate that marked the entrance to his farm, the day was already waning. The house, patched and weather-worn, stood against the backdrop of fields still green from spring rains. Children played in the yard, their laughter carried by the wind. But when they saw what trailed behind their father, their giggles faltered into whispers. His wife stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting perhaps to see a calf or young horse, something useful that would bring hope to their tired days. Instead, her eyes fell on the gaunt figure of the donkey. She did not speak at first, but the furrow of her brow and the tightening of her lips told him more than words ever could. She turned back into the house without comment, and he felt the silence between them heavier than any rebuke. That night, when the chores were done, and the lantern cast a pale circle of light around the kitchen table, the farmer sat with his family. The children asked cautious questions, their voices uncertain, while his wife remained quiet, her gaze lowered to her hands folded in her lap. He explained in the simplest way that the donkey had needed someone, and he had been there to answer. The words sounded fragile, almost foolish in the small room where every scrap of food was counted and every coin carefully stored. His wife did not argue, but neither did she offer approval. She only nodded faintly, her silence a reminder of the practical burdens that weighed on them all. The donkey spent his first night in a corner of the yard, where an old shelter leaned crookedly against the fence. The farmer spread straw on the ground, though it was damp and thin, and placed a bucket of water beside a pile of hay. The animal sniffed at the food without interest, then lowered himself slowly to the ground, with a sigh that sounded almost human in its exhaustion. The farmer lingered there longer than he needed, leaning against the fence and watching the animal's sides rise and fall with shallow breaths. He wondered if by morning his purchase would already lie still and lifeless. Yet when dawn broke, the donkey rose shakily to his feet, alive but no stronger than before. The days that followed were filled with trial and frustration. Each morning the farmer offered oats, cut grass, even scraps of vegetables from the kitchen, but the donkey ate little. His ribs remained visible, his eyes dull. When the farmer attempted to lead him to the field, he obeyed but without energy, stumbling often and stopping to rest with alarming frequency. The man could feel the weight of his neighbor's eyes upon him. They passed along the road, their glances lingering just long enough to convey judgment. Some laughed openly, others only shook their heads, but all seemed certain that the animal was nothing but a drain on already strained resources. At night, when the farmer returned from long hours of labor, he sometimes found his wife sitting on the porch with worry etched across her face. She spoke softly of their needs, the children's growing appetites, the bills that pressed harder each month. Though she did not mention the donkey directly, her meaning was clear. Every mouth fed at their table had to earn its place, and this one, gaunt and silent in the yard, gave nothing back. The farmer listened, nodded, and shouldered the burden of her unspoken fears. He knew she was not wrong, but something inside him refused to let go of the choice he had made. There were moments of doubt, darker than the nights that fell heavy over the farm. Once, as he stood by the donkey's side in the quiet hours before dawn, watching the frail creature chew half-heartedly at a wisp of hay, he felt the sharp sting of regret. He thought of the jeering crowd at the auction, of the coins he could have saved, of the practical decisions he might have made instead. For a breath, he almost wished he could undo it all, send the animal away, erase the laughter that still haunted him. But then the donkey raised his head, meeting his gaze with eyes that carried not despair, but a patient endurance. In that look, the farmer recognized something familiar, the strength to withstand humiliation, to keep walking despite the weight of scorn. It steadied him, reminding him why he had chosen when others turned away. Gradually, the farmer's care began to leave its mark. He built a better shelter, using scraps of lumber salvaged from old repairs. He lined it with straw gathered from the fields and patched holes in the roof with tin, so the rain no longer fell in cold streams onto the ground below. He sat with the donkey in the evenings, brushing his coat with an old curry comb until the dull hair began to take on a muted sheen. He offered apples from his orchard, cutting them into slices to coax a flicker of appetite from the tired beast. Some days the donkey refused, but on others he accepted, chewing slowly as though relearning the simple act of nourishment. The farmer's neighbors noticed his efforts, though not with admiration. They whispered that he was wasting not only his money but his time that might have been spent tending crops or mending tools. Children in the village laughed when they passed by, mocking the animal that barely seemed able to stand. Yet despite the mockery, the farmer held to his routine, rising before dawn to check the animal's water, staying after dusk to see that he was sheltered from the night air. It became a rhythm, as much a part of his day as milking the cows or plowing the fields. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the farmer stood once again by the donkey's side. He had placed fresh hay before him, and for the first time the animal ate with more eagerness than before, pulling mouthfuls steadily until the pile began to shrink. When he finished, he turned toward the farmer and, in a gesture that seemed almost deliberate, pressed his head lightly against the man's arm. The touch was brief, but it carried a weight greater than words. It was trust, tentative, yet real, and it stirred something deep within the farmer's chest. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the soft creak of the house settling into silence, He thought of that gesture. It was enough to keep doubt at bay, enough to remind him that life often moved in small, almost imperceptible steps. He remembered how seeds planted in rough soil could remain hidden for weeks before showing the faintest green shoot, and he thought perhaps this was the same. Patience, he reminded himself. Patience and care. The donkey was no different from the earth itself. Both required faith in things unseen. The days continued, marked by hardship and tiny victories. The donkey walked a little steadier now, lifted his head a little higher, ate a little more than before. He was far from strong, but he was alive, and each sign of life gave the farmer reason to hope. The ridicule from neighbors did not cease, nor did the quiet concern of his wife, but he carried himself with a steadiness that came from belief rather than proof. The trials of those first days forged a bond not easily broken. Though frailty still clung to the donkey's body, and doubt still shadowed the farmer's mind, the path they had begun together was clear. It was not the path of ease or quick reward, but of slow, stubborn resilience. And though neither man nor beast could yet know it, these early trials were the foundation upon which their future would be built. A future where the scorn of the crowd would give way to something far greater. Spring deepened into its full glory as days stretched longer, and the farmer's land seemed to breathe with a renewed spirit. Yet for him, the true measure of the season's promise was not in the greening of the fields, but in the quiet transformation that began to stir within the frail body of the donkey he had brought home from the auction. The first weeks had been filled with frustration and doubt, nights haunted by the whispers of neighbors and the steady silence of his wife, who could not understand why he insisted on pouring scarce resources into what looked like a lost cause. But patience has a way of repaying those who persist. And now at last the signs of change began to reveal themselves. The donkey had started to eat with something resembling appetite. It was not the greedy hunger of a healthy animal, but rather a slow, deliberate acceptance of sustenance, as if he had remembered that food was meant to strengthen rather than merely to pass the time until death. The farmer noticed that his ribs, once stark ridges beneath skin, were softening ever so slightly, and the dull coat that had hung like a tattered cloak began to glimmer faintly under the sunlight. It was no miracle, no sudden rebirth, but a gradual return, the kind that demanded patience and rewarded faith. Each morning before the household stirred, the farmer would step quietly into the yard, carrying a bucket of water cool from the well and a measure of hay freshly cut. The donkey greeted him now not with indifference but with a flicker of recognition. His ears twitched, his head lifted, and though his movements were slow, they were no longer burdened with the resignation of a creature waiting for the end. The farmer often stood there longer than necessary, his hand resting on the animal's bony neck, marveling at the subtle changes that only one who looked closely could notice. It was on one such morning that the donkey surprised him with a gesture so simple and yet so profound, it lingered in his thoughts for days. After finishing a modest portion of hay, the animal turned his head toward the farmer and pressed it gently against his shoulder. It was not an accident nor a fleeting touch, but a moment of quiet communion. The farmer froze, then slowly raised his hand to stroke the rough fur along the donkey's cheek. In that instant, the bond between them deepened into something beyond caretaker and burden. It became a partnership rooted in trust. Encouraged by these small signs, the farmer began to test the animal's strength in cautious steps. He led him beyond the yard, into the meadows at the edge of his fields, letting him walk where grass grew tall and soft beneath their feet. At first, the donkey stumbled often, his legs weak from disuse, but with each outing his steps grew surer. He learned to follow the farmer's steady pace, and the rhythm of their movements became as natural as the turning of the earth beneath them. On one occasion, when the farmer paused at a stream to let him drink, the donkey lowered his head and drank deeply, the sound of water lapping a reassurance that life, once fragile, now clung with firmer grasp. The neighbors remained unconvinced. They saw the pair wandering through the fields and shook their heads, muttering about wasted effort. Some laughed openly, remembering the auction and the humiliation of that day. Yet the farmer paid them no mind. His eyes were fixed on the progress he alone could measure, the slow return of vitality that no crowd would have patience to witness. He brushed the donkey's coat each evening with an old horse brush he had found in the barn, coaxing the dirt and knots from the once neglected hair until it lay smoother beneath his touch. The donkey stood still beneath this care, his eyes half closed, as though savoring the sensation of gentleness long forgotten. Work came gradually, introduced not as burden, but as gentle challenge. The farmer fashioned a small cart from scraps of wood, light enough for a child to pull, and harnessed the donkey to it with a rope halter. At first the animal balked, uncertain of this new demand, but the farmer spoke softly, guiding him step by step until the cart rolled forward. They did not travel far those first days, only a few paces across the yard, then a short path down to the orchard, but each attempt strengthened the donkey's legs and spirit. By the end of the week he could pull a small load of firewood without faltering, and the sight filled the farmer with quiet pride. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Some evenings the donkey sank to the ground with exhaustion, his body trembling as though he had spent more strength than he possessed. The farmer would sit beside him, offering an apple sliced into quarters, waiting patiently until the animal accepted it. He spoke no words, but his presence was enough, and the donkey seemed to draw comfort from the steady hand that rested on his back. The children, once skeptical, began to show curiosity. They crept closer while the farmer brushed the animal, daring to reach out small hands to touch the rough coat. The donkey stood patiently, allowing their timid strokes, and the children's laughter carried a new tone, no longer mocking, but filled with wonder. Even the farmer's wife, though she still carried doubt in her heart, could not ignore the changes. She saw how the animal now followed her husband with ears perked, how he lifted his head when the farmer's voice reached him, how his coat glistened faintly in the light of dusk. Though she said little, her eyes softened when they fell upon the pair. Weeks passed, and with them the bond between man and animal grew stronger. The donkey, once lifeless, now walked with a cautious but undeniable strength. He began to greet the mornings not with indifference but with a slow bray that echoed across the yard, a sound that stirred something like hope within the farmhouse walls. The farmer felt his own spirit lift with each new sign of progress. Where once he had feared ridicule, he now carried himself with quiet assurance, knowing that the decision mocked by many had already begun to bear fruit. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber, the farmer led the donkey along the edge of the field where tall grass swayed in the breeze. He stopped and looked back at the creature who now walked with steadier steps, and a smile touched his face. The memory of that first day at the auction returned to him, the jeers of the crowd, the sting of humiliation. How different it all seemed now. He thought of the lesson hidden in the journey so far, that life, when given patience and care, could surprise even the most skeptical hearts. The donkey lifted his head and looked at him with eyes no longer dull, but alive with quiet intelligence. In that gaze, the farmer saw not weakness, but resilience, not burden, but possibility. It was the awakening of life, slow and humble, yet profound. And though the road ahead promised more trials, he felt ready to walk it, for he no longer walked alone with a broken creature, but alongside a companion who had begun to remember his own strength. The farmer turned back toward home, the donkey following close behind. The fields whispered with the promise of coming work, and the air carried the scent of change. The awakening had begun, and with it, a new chapter of their shared story unfolded. A chapter that would test the measure of faith and reveal the true worth hidden in what the world had dismissed. The weeks of patient care and slow progress ripened into something tangible as the season leaned into the fullness of spring. The fields had grown thick with grass, the soil dark and ready for work, and the farmer felt the pressing need to prepare for planting. All through the winter and early spring, his family had scraped by, counting every coin and rationing food carefully. And now the fields were his chance to restore some measure of security. But as he stood in the yard one morning, looking at the donkey who had begun to show real signs of life, he knew this was the moment when faith would be tested, not in the quiet rhythms of feeding and brushing, but in the practical demands of work. The animal had grown stronger. His ribs were no longer as sharp against his skin, and his coat had taken on a sheen that caught the morning light. His steps, once faltering and hesitant, now carried a steady rhythm, cautious but sure. The farmer had harnessed him only to small loads before baskets of apples, a bundle of kindling, the light cart he had cobbled together from old wood. Those tasks had been meant as lessons, to rebuild strength without crushing the fragile spirit that had only recently begun to awaken. Now the work ahead required more. The farmer knew that the plowing of his fields was no small task, and though he did not expect the donkey to pull like a horse or an ox, he needed to know whether the animal could shoulder even a modest share of the burden. That morning he led the donkey into the field where the earth waited, rich and heavy. The plow stood ready, its iron blade dulled by years of use but still sharp enough to cut through soil. The farmer paused, resting his hand on the worn wooden handle, feeling the weight of doubt press against his resolve. He could hear the words of his neighbors, the mocking laughter from the auction, the quiet concern of his wife. What if they had been right? What if the donkey, despite his progress, was still too frail for the task? Yet another voice rose within him, quieter but stronger, the same voice that had compelled him to place his bid that day when everyone else turned away. That voice reminded him that the worth of a creature was not always measured in the strength of its first steps, but in the will to keep moving forward. He fastened the harness with care, speaking softly to calm the animal as he adjusted the straps. The donkey shifted, ears flicking, but did not resist. When the farmer finally took his place behind the plow and gave the gentle command to move, the donkey leaned forward. The first steps were halting, the soil resisting as though testing them both. But then the blade cut into the earth, and the line of freshly turned soil stretched out like a promise. The farmer felt a surge of pride so sudden it nearly took his breath. The donkey, once dismissed as useless, was plowing his field. The work was slow. Each furrow took time, and the donkey needed frequent rests, his sides heaving as sweat darkened his coat. The farmer allowed it, never pushing too hard, knowing that progress measured in steady endurance was more valuable than speed. By midday, they had cut only a fraction of the field, but the earth was broken, ready for seed, and the farmer knew that was enough. He patted the donkey's neck, murmuring words of encouragement, and the animal flicked his ears back as though listening. It was not a triumph anyone else would have celebrated, but to the farmer it was a victory greater than gold. From the road, neighbors watched. Some leaned against fences, shaking their heads with wry smiles, certain that the donkey would collapse before the season was done. Others muttered that the farmer's stubbornness would cost him dearly when the crops failed for lack of proper preparation. Yet there were a few who lingered longer, their expressions tinged with something other than mockery, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the faint stirring of doubt in their own certainty. They saw the donkey, sweat-streaked and weary but still moving, and for a moment they wondered whether they had misjudged both man and beast. The farmer's family observed as well. His children, once wary of the strange, unwanted animal, ran along the edges of the field, their laughter carrying in the breeze. They cheered when the plow cut through the soil, their voices rising in innocent belief that something important was happening before their eyes. Even his wife, though she stood at a distance with her arms folded, could not entirely hide the flicker of surprise that crossed her face. She had braced herself for failure, but the sight of the donkey pulling, steady and willing, softened the doubt that had weighed so heavily in her heart. As days passed, the farmer and his donkey returned to the field again and again. They worked in the cool of morning and the long shadows of evening, resting during the hottest hours when the sun pressed down with merciless weight. Each day the donkey grew a little stronger, his steps more sure, his body more resilient. The plow cut deeper, straighter furrows, and the field began to take shape under their shared effort. The farmer's hands blistered on the handle, his back ached, and his muscles cried for rest. But the sight of his companion straining beside him, giving all he had, filled him with a determination he had not felt in years. The bond between them deepened in those days. The farmer spoke often as they worked, his voice carrying the rhythm of encouragement, while the donkey listened, his ears swiveling toward each sound. When they paused, the farmer shared slices of apple or handfuls of oats, and the donkey took them with grateful patience. At night, the farmer brushed his coat, combing away the dust of the field, and the animal stood quietly, eyes half closed, trusting the hands that had once seemed strange. The laughter of the village still echoed from time to time, But the farmer no longer felt its sting. Each furrow in his field, each step the donkey took, was proof enough that he had chosen rightly. He did not need their approval. What mattered was the soil beneath his feet, the sweat on his brow, and the quiet strength of the animal who had once been written off as worthless. Together they were reshaping not only the land, but the story others had tried to write for them. By the time the fields were fully plowed, the farmer knew something important had changed. It was not simply that his land was ready for planting, or that the donkey had proven capable of labor. It was the knowledge that faith, when tested, had been rewarded. He saw it in the way his children looked at the animal now, with affection instead of doubt. He saw it in his wife's eyes, where skepticism had begun to yield to quiet respect. He even saw it in the wary glances of neighbors, who no longer laughed as freely as before. The first trials in the field had not been easy. They had demanded strength, patience, and resilience from both man and beast. But they had also revealed something greater, the truth that worth was not defined by the judgment of a crowd or the weakness of a first impression. The donkey, once mocked and despised, now stood in the twilight of the field with muscles taut, coat shining, and eyes alive with quiet purpose. The farmer stood beside him, weary yet proud, knowing that this was only the beginning. The hardest seasons still lay ahead, and greater trials would come, but together they had proven they could face the weight of labor and endure. As the sun set in a blaze of red across the horizon, the farmer rested his hand on the donkey's neck. The field stretched out before them, rich with turned earth, ready for seed. Behind them lay the long memory of mockery, but ahead lay the promise of harvest. The farmer knew that when the time came, it would not be remembered that the work had been slow or the animal old. What would be remembered was that the work had been done, and it had been done together. The spring's promise ripened into a summer that began as fair and gentle as any farmer could hope for. The fields that had been so carefully plowed and seeded under the slow but steady labor of the farmer and his donkey grew green with rows of young plants. Shoots of corn rose bravely from the dark soil, beans stretched toward the sun, and the vegetable garden behind the house filled with the tender leaves of cabbages, squash, and tomatoes. For a time it seemed as though the farmer's faith had been fully rewarded. His neighbors, who had laughed so loudly when he led the frail donkey home, now watched with guarded curiosity as the land thrived under his care. Though they still muttered their doubts in private, the sight of the donkey working day after day, cutting furrows, hauling water, and carrying loads from field to storehouse could not be denied. Yet the mountains and valleys of their land were governed by forces no man could command, and nature soon revealed how fragile even the strongest determination could become. By mid-July, the skies grew stubborn and withheld their rains. Clouds gathered on distant horizons but drifted away without spilling their blessings upon the earth. The creek that wound its way through the valley shrank, its edges cracked with thirst, until it became little more than a trickle slipping between exposed stones. The fields, once lush with green, began to pale and curl beneath the unrelenting sun. Day after day, the farmer stood in his fields, sweat soaking through his shirt, watching as the leaves wilted and the soil hardened into dust. The donkey, too, felt the strain. His steady strength, which had carried them through the work of spring, was tested by the endless heat. Each trip to the distant well became longer and more exhausting, the heavy barrels of water straining even his restored muscles. Still, he did not falter. Each morning, when the farmer called, he rose from his stall, ears twitching, and followed into the fields without hesitation. His sides heaved, his coat darkened with sweat, but his will remained. The farmer often paused to run a hand along his neck, murmuring gratitude, knowing that without this companion, the fight against the drought would already have been lost. The neighbors were not so fortunate. Some abandoned their weaker crops altogether, resigning themselves to a poor harvest. Others looked to the sky with bitterness, cursing their luck and complaining that nothing could withstand such cruel weather. In the tavern, whispers grew sharp once more. They said the farmer was wasting his strength on land that would not yield, that his donkey would collapse before the rains ever returned. Some even suggested that all his work was nothing more than stubborn pride dressed as faith. But the farmer, though he heard their words and felt their weight, would not let them turn him from his task. He had made a promise to himself the day he first laid his hand on the donkey's frail muzzle at the auction that he would not abandon what others dismissed. That promise bound him now more tightly than ever. The days became harder as the drought deepened. The farmer and his donkey labored from dawn to dusk, hauling water in barrels, pouring precious drops onto the soil to keep the roots alive. The farmer's hands cracked from the dryness, his back burned beneath the sun, and his body grew thin with exhaustion. His wife begged him to rest, fearing that he was breaking himself for fields that could not be saved. Yet each time he looked at the donkey, straining to pull yet another load of water, his resolve was renewed. Together they fought, and though the battle seemed hopeless, it was a battle worth waging. One afternoon, when the heat shimmered across the valley like a curtain of fire, the farmer nearly lost his hope. He and the donkey had spent the entire morning carrying water, but the ground seemed to drink it greedily, leaving no trace of their efforts. The plants drooped as if mocking his labor, and the air itself felt heavy with despair. He sank to his knees in the dust, head bowed, and for the first time he wondered if he had been wrong. Perhaps the neighbors had been right all along. Perhaps he had gambled his family's future on a dream as fragile as the donkey's bones had once been. His eyes stung, not from sweat but from the burning ache of defeat that pressed against his chest. It was then that he felt the shadow fall across him. He lifted his head and saw the donkey standing over him, ears forward, eyes steady. The animal did not falter, did not question. He simply waited, patient and enduring, as if to say that despair had no place while strength remained. The farmer rose slowly, brushing the dust from his knees, and laid his hand on the donkey's neck. He realized then that the true test of faith was not whether the rains came or the harvest thrived. The true test was whether he would keep moving forward even when every sign pointed toward failure. The drought dragged on. Weeks passed with no relief, and many families in the valley gave up hope entirely. Yet the farmer and his donkey continued their relentless routine. They rose before dawn, worked until their bodies trembled, and rested only long enough to gather the strength to begin again. The farmer's children carried buckets alongside their father, learning the value of perseverance in the face of trial. His wife, though still worried, no longer tried to dissuade him. She saw in his eyes and in the steady rhythm of the donkey's steps that this fight was about more than a single harvest. It was about dignity, about proving that courage could survive even in the harshest season. At last, when August threatened to close with no reprieve, the sky began to change. A wind blew in from the west, heavy with the scent of rain. Clouds gathered thick and dark, rolling over the mountains with the slow power of destiny. When the first drops fell, the farmer stood in his field, arms raised, as the parched soil drank deeply of the gift it had long been denied. The donkey lifted his head, ears twitching, and brayed into the storm as if sharing in his master's triumph. The rain poured in torrents, soaking the cracked ground, filling the creek, washing the dust from the leaves of plants that had somehow clung to life through all those cruel weeks. The harvest that year was not abundant. Many of the crops had withered beyond saving, and the yield was smaller than in years past. Yet the farmer knew as he gathered what remained that he had been given something far more precious than bushels of grain or baskets of vegetables. He had been given proof that perseverance, even when mocked and doubted, could withstand the fiercest trials. The donkey, once ridiculed as worthless, had carried them through the fire of the drought, his strength and patience shaping each day into survival. When the farmer brought his modest harvest to town, the laughter that had once followed him was quiet. Neighbors watched in silence as he unloaded his wagons, their eyes drawn again and again to the donkey who stood beside him, lean but strong, ears flicking in the autumn breeze. There were no jeers this time, no cruel jokes, only the heavy weight of respect, unspoken but undeniable, settling over the crowd. Some even stepped forward to offer a nod or a few words of admiration, though pride kept them from saying too much. The farmer did not seek their praise. He knew that true victory lay not in the opinions of others, but in the quiet truth of what he and his donkey had endured. As he walked home that evening, the fading sun casting gold across the valley, he felt a peace that no ridicule could touch. The drought had been the harshest test of his life, but it had revealed a strength within him, and within the animal he had chosen to believe in, that nothing could take away. And so the moment of truth passed, not with the grand triumph of overflowing barns or overflowing purses, but with the deeper triumph of survival, dignity, and the knowledge that worth is proven in the fire of adversity. The farmer knew the seasons would bring new trials, for that was the way of life in the valley. But whatever came, he would face it with the same quiet determination, walking beside the donkey who had taught him that faith once planted could weather even the cruelest drought. The rains that finally broke the drought brought not only relief to the parched fields, but also a slow change in the way the community began to look upon the farmer and his donkey. The harvest, though modest, had proven that their tireless labor and refusal to surrender could carve survival out of hopelessness. For years, the farmer had lived in the shadow of ridicule, his decisions mocked and his stubbornness criticized. Yet now his resilience had forced people to reconsider what they thought they knew. He did not boast, nor did he claim victory. He returned to his quiet life, working each day as he had before, guided by the rhythm of seasons and the bond he had forged with the animal no one else had wanted. But in silence, a transformation was underway, as neighbors who once laughed began to see not foolishness, but wisdom. In the weeks that followed the end of the drought, people came quietly to the farmer's gate. At first, they came only to ask questions, their tone cautious, their words halting, as though admitting respect might shame them. They wanted to know how he had kept his crops alive when theirs had failed. They wanted to understand how a donkey, so weak and frail when first brought home, had managed to endure what even their strongest horses had not. The farmer answered simply, with the humility that marked his nature. He spoke not of miracles but of patience, steady work, and the belief that no creature was truly without worth if given care and purpose. And those who listened walked away changed, though few would openly admit it. As autumn ripened into winter, the story of the farmer and his donkey spread beyond the valley. Traders carried tales to neighboring towns, telling of the man who had survived the drought with the help of an animal that everyone else had dismissed. Visitors began arriving, some out of curiosity, others out of admiration. They watched the donkey pulling steady loads of firewood, carrying baskets of late turnips from the frost-hardened fields, or standing quietly while children stroked his muzzle. What they saw was no longer the frail creature of the auction yard, but a living testament to resilience and trust. The children of the village, who once joined in laughter at the farmer's expense, now gathered eagerly when he led the donkey to market. They asked for stories about the drought, about the long days of hauling water and the nights when hope seemed to fade. The farmer, though never a man of many words, shared what he could. He told them that the land will test those who work it, but those who meet its trials with courage will always find strength they did not know they had. He told them that even the weakest creature may hold hidden gifts if only someone chooses to believe. And as the children listened, their eyes wide, the lessons sank deeper than mere words. They were inheriting not just stories, but a way of seeing the world. By the time spring returned, the farmer's life had changed in ways he had never sought. Where once he had been the object of pity or derision, he was now looked upon with quiet reverence. Neighbors sought his advice on planting and weather, believing that a man who had endured the worst might have wisdom worth heeding. Some even began to bring their own neglected animals to him, asking for guidance on how to restore them. The farmer did what he could, offering feed, shelter, and the lessons he had learned through trial and hardship. Though he never claimed to be a healer or a teacher, his steady presence became both. The donkey, once a symbol of mockery, became something greater than the farmer could have imagined. He walked at his master's side with a dignity that could not be denied, his ears pricking at every sound, his steps measured and strong. People began to speak of him not as a beast of burden, but as a companion, almost a partner in the farmer's work. There were those who swore that the animal seemed to understand words, that he carried himself with an awareness uncommon among creatures. Children gave him apples and scraps of bread, and even the most skeptical farmers began to nod in grudging respect when he passed. The recognition reached its quiet peak one summer day when the community gathered for the annual fair. In past years, the farmer had been invisible there, keeping to the edges while others competed, sold their wares, and showed off their livestock. But this year was different. When he led his donkey into the square, The murmurs that rose were not derisive, but admiring. People pointed not to mock, but to remind one another of the tale they all now knew, how man and beast had faced the worst drought in living memory and endured when others had faltered. The donkey with his weathered coat and calm eyes stood as proof that value is not measured by appearances, but by perseverance. The elders of the community, who had once shaken their heads at what they called foolish stubbornness, invited the farmer to speak. He did so reluctantly, for he was never one to seek attention. But when he stood before them, his voice carried with a quiet strength that silenced the crowd. He spoke of humility, of working with what one is given rather than longing for what is lost. He spoke of the dignity of creatures, both human and animal, and of the duty to see worth where others see none. And when he finished, there was no laughter, no jeering, only silence, followed by the sound of hands clapping, slow at first, then rising into a steady applause. In the years that followed, the story became part of the valley's memory. The children who had once watched with curiosity grew into adults who carried the lesson with them. They remembered the farmer's words, the donkey's patient endurance, and the harvest that had come not from strength alone, but from faith and compassion. Some of them would tell their own children how the weakest animal had taught the community the meaning of resilience, how a man's quiet courage had silenced the laughter of a town. And so the tale, rooted in hardship, blossomed into a legacy. The farmer never sought monuments or songs. He continued to live simply, rising each day to tend his fields, mending fences, caring for his family, and walking the trails with his donkey at his side. The seasons turned, as they always did, bringing rain and sun, hardship and ease. Yet through it all, the bond between man and animal remained, a constant reminder that faith, once given, creates strength that cannot be broken. When the farmer grew old, his back bent and his hair silver, he was still seen walking the same paths, leaning a little on his stick, the donkey still keeping step beside him. In time, the farmer's name became less important than the story itself. People spoke not so much of who he was, but of what he had shown them, that value lies not in what is obvious, but in what is hidden, waiting for someone to see. The donkey, too, became more than a beast. His image lived on in memory, in the whispered tales told at hearthsides and in the lessons passed from one generation to the next. He was the creature no one wanted, who had carried water through the drought and plowed fields when laughter said he could not. He became, in his quiet way, a legend. And so the recognition grew not from glory or wealth, but from the quiet respect of those who had once scorned and now remembered. The farmer's legacy was not built in barns filled with abundance, but in hearts that learned to look differently at the world around them. His life became proof that compassion and perseverance leave marks deeper than any harvest. And though seasons changed and years passed into decades, the memory endured of a man who believed in what others mocked, and of a donkey who carried that belief across fields, through drought, and into the very soul of a community. For in the end, legacies are not carved in stone, but written in the soil, in the lives touched, and in the laughter turned to reverence. And the valley, once a place of mockery, became instead a place of remembrance, where every child grew up knowing that sometimes the greatest strength hides within the frailest frame, waiting only for someone to see it and give it a chance to rise. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. We've got more powerful tales waiting for you. Click here to watch the next video and dive even deeper. And if you know someone who needs a little inspiration today, share this video with them right now. You never know whose life it might change.